Welcome to the Knowledge Seeker channel. The channel is dedicated to exploring critical issues in the world. This is part 2 of the presentation titled Civilian Political Coups Instigate Military Intervention in Africa. Thus, this part 2 identifies specific policies, actions, and inactions carried out by civilian political rulers that instigate military intervention in Africa. Please listen to both presentations in order to have a complete understanding of the factors that instigate military coups in the continent. This map shows the 54 countries that make up Africa today. The purpose of this presentation is to achieve two goals. One, explore the issue of coup d'etat or the sudden unconstitutional change of government in Africa. And two, identify the ways in which civilian political coups, that is, actions and inactions, instigate the military to intervene in Africa. In order to accomplish the goals, the following arguments are made. One, the artificiality of African countries generates conditions for African rulers to act unconstitutionally and undemocratically. Two, the unconstitutional and undemocratic tendencies of African rulers are responsible for provoking the military to stage coups. And three, as far as African ruling elites continue to violate the constitutions of their countries by indulging in undemocratic practices, military coups will continue to take place in the continent. This is an ongoing military coup. As you can see, a group of soldiers are surrounded by a mass of civilians who are jubilating because the military has taken over the government. This data shows military coup trends in Africa. As you can see, in the 1950s, there were very few coups. Then in the 1960s, there were so many coups. 1970s, there were many coups. 1980s, there were many coups. 1990s, there were many coups. However, if you look at the successful coups vis-a-vis the unsuccessful coups, you can see that in the 1960s, there were so many successful coups as indicated by the dark blue line. In the 1970s, there were more unsuccessful coups, even though there was still a high rate of military coups succeeding. Then in the 1980s, the coups were very, very successful. Then in the 1990s, the rate of success in military coups went down slightly, while the rate of unsuccessful coups went up very highly. In the 2009, the rate of military coups succeeding were almost half, while there were so many unsuccessful coups. In 2010, 2019, it was about even between the successful coups and the unsuccessful coups. But in 2022, 2023, the rate of military coup succeeding is increasing. That shows that the continent is restless, and that means millions of Africans are not happy with their political situation. Hence, the military is being agitated to act. Now, let's look at the factors, that is, the actions and the inactions that prompt military coups in Africa. So, the following 28 identified factors tend to instigate military intervention in Africa. So, let's look at them one by one. 1. Modern African countries were arbitrarily created by European powers through military conquest. The Europeans did not care about the indigenous ethnic groups that constituted the colonies. This meant that African ethnic nationalities had no choice but to accept their fate by being placed in colonial territories that had nothing to do with them. In some cases, historically antagonistic ethnic groups were placed together as members of the same colonies, and they had no choice in determining whether they wanted to belong to these colonies or not. This creates perpetual distrust and instability that provides an opportunity for the military to intervene today, because there are still many ethnic groups that are not happy in the states they are. The failure of indigenous African rulers to redraw the territorial boundaries to suit the indigenous groups after the so-called independence is a source of constant conflict that leads to potential military coups. 2. The fact that African rulers continue to run governments left behind by the external colonialists means that they are not interested in independence, but simply take political power from the external colonialists. Hence, they act like internal colonialists and work cooperatively with the external colonialists to continue to perpetuate colonialism, which is referred to as internal colonialism here. 3. Most politicians get into power under the banner of democracy through rigged elections in Africa. Most elections are rigged by the incumbents and the ruling political parties against the general interest of the citizens. 4. As soon as they get into power through rigged elections, they ignore the constitutions and the laws, believing that they are above the law and can do as they wish. They begin to act in an authoritarian manner and become oppressive. 5. They nepotize, tribalize, and regionalize governance by filling the most important government positions with members of their families, ethnic groups, and regions. By so doing, they discriminate against other individuals, ethnic groups, and regions. This provokes anger that feeds the desire of the military to intervene. 6. The rulers act as if they are monarchs. Indeed, most African rulers tend to believe that they can mobilize the security forces to protect and shield them from the wrath of the citizens, thereby enabling them to do as they wish without consequences. 7. The democratic system works when differing and or alternative points of view are allowed to flourish so that the citizens can decide who to vote for and what political party to support when election time comes. However, those in power generally do not allow alternative points of view to prevail by clamping down on opposition candidates, political parties, the media, and the citizens. Thus, the rulers use security forces to constantly harass members of the opposition parties and file false criminal charges against the leaders of the opposition to stop them from mounting effective political campaigns against them. Similarly, citizens are harassed, threatened, and even killed for being critical of those in political power. When citizens become frustrated, they start putting pressure on the military to kick out the rascals in power. 8. Many political rulers in Africa get into power through the manipulation of foreign colonial masters and other foreign powers who are interested in exploiting the resources in their countries. Believing that they are protected by their former colonial masters and other foreign powers, they ignore the citizens and act as they like. An example was the late Mobutu Sese Seko of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the late President Omar Bongo of Gabon. Generally, African rulers who got into power through the active support of their former colonial masters and other foreign powers tend to conceptualize that they do not have to answer to the citizens since they are dealing with powerful outside political entities that will protect them against their citizens. There are so many countries that go through this. For example, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, Benin, Togo, Central African Republic, and Congo-Brazzaville fall under this type of arrangement. 9. They align with the former colonial powers and multinational corporations to exploit the people and the resources. Hence, Professor Mustapha Mehta of the Media Review Network stated, and I quote, "France is too involved in the affairs of many of these West African states, and it still wants to manipulate these countries and continue to milk them." Unquote. And there are many examples to cite from. A. It is alleged in a 2007 police investigation in France that the Bongo family owned 39 properties and had 70 bank accounts. The family squandered most of Gabon's oil wealth. B. President Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo of Equatorial Guinea is worth $600 million. C. In Nigeria, it is insisted that petroleum and gas resources are owned exclusively by the national government, and the citizens agree. Yet, a few highly connected individuals own the oil stocks, which in Nigeria are referred to as oil blocks, thereby exploiting the citizens and accumulating massive private wealth. The oil region is rendered poor and devastated environmentally, and nobody does anything about it. 10. Generally, part of the deal in being supported by their former colonial masters and other foreign powers is to allow the multinational corporations from those countries to exploit the African resources with very little compensation for the citizens. Hence, despite the enormous wealth that Africa possesses, the people remains poor because most of the wealth is sent out to benefit foreign countries, multinational corporations, and the ruling elite. In return, African officials and their families end up with only about 5 or 10% of the proceeds generated through the exploration of the massive African resources. 11. Due to whining and dining with the former colonial powers and other powerful states that wanted to exploit the resources in Africa, some African rulers who deviated from the secret deals made to serve as stooges and conduits for the foreign exploitation of their resources risk being overthrown by coups staged by the foreign interests to perpetuate the status quo that favors them. Professor Sultan Kakuba of Kambogo University in Uganda noted, and I quote, "Some of the Western countries support leaders who serve their interests, but once a leader stops serving their demands, they plan for his ouster." That means that when these compromised African leaders refuse to dance to the interests of those who put them in power, then the foreign interests might decide to kick them out by encouraging military coups to take place. 12. Throughout the African continent, as they supposedly win elections to become presidents and prime ministers, they do not want to leave office after the expiration of their terms of office. Instead of leaving to allow other political candidates to compete for the top leadership positions, they cajole the rubber-stamped parliaments to amend the constitutions to allow them to rule endlessly. Thus, in every country in Africa, the so-called national assemblies are always too eager to amend the constitutions to favor the ruling clique. Hence, Africa holds the gold medal for the International Olympics for politicians who rule their countries for 15, 20, 30, and even 40 years or more, as if they are monarchs. This problem cuts across the entire continent, including the North African countries of Algeria, Egypt, Sudan, Tunisia, as well as Cameroon, Congo-Brazzaville, Chad, Equatorial Guinea, Angola, and so on and so forth. See, this is a caption of rule for life syndrome in the continent. 13. Many African rulers loot public treasuries and convert the funds into personal wealth. Indeed, many African rulers treat state funds as their personal finances. As a result, they transfer as much as they want to their foreign bank accounts and enrich themselves. Due to the massive looting of public funds, financial allocations for the general well-being of the citizens are limited. Hence, most African countries have no social welfare programs. The citizens are forced to be on their own at all times, while the rulers feast on public funds. Nigeria, for instance, with a population of over 200 million people, has no social welfare program, and neither does it have a national health insurance to alleviate suffering and poverty, while the ruling elites are wealthy through mostly looting of public funds. Again, this is a caption about the looting of African wealth. 14. Apart from the ruling elite embezzling public funds massively, they also make sure that their children become extraordinarily wealthy. It is possible to say that the children of many African rulers are millionaires, even though some of them are still in the university. Some children become billionaires without being able to explain the sources of their wealth. Quite often, the parents make sure that major contracts in their countries go through some arrangements in which their children and family members benefit, thereby enriching them. There are many examples to cite from. A. The daughter of former President Jose Eduardo dos Santos of Angola is widely reported to be a billionaire. Forbes magazine reported that she was worth about 2.2 billion around 2020. B. The son of President Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbazogo of Equatorial Guinea was alleged to have spent millions of dollars while living in Europe. Reuters reported that Britain, and I quote, sanctioned the son of Equatorial Guinea's president for misappropriating millions of dollars, which London said was spent on luxury mansions, private jets, and a US $275,000 glove worn by Michael Jackson, and I unquote. See, the son of current President Tinubu of Nigeria is alleged to have bought a house worth $10.8 million in Britain. D. Some relatives of former President Buhari of Nigeria are alleged to now be worth billions of dollars, even though some of them were poor prior to President Buhari ascending the political throne in the country. 15. Apart from ensuring that their children and family members become financially endowed through the state, many African rulers want their children to take over the mantle of leadership from them, thereby turning their countries into political dynasties in which their families reign supreme. There are many examples to cite. A. The late Muammar Gaddafi of Libya allegedly prepared his son, Saif al-Islam, to possibly replace him. Unfortunately, NATO's military intervention stopped the effort. B. Former President Hosni Mubarak of Egypt allegedly groomed his son to take over the mantle of Egyptian leadership from him. But the Arab Spring put a stop to that dream. C. Former President Jacob Zuma of South Africa was alleged to have groomed his son to become a potential leader of the country, but the corrupt charges filed against him put a stop to that effort. D. President Teodoro Nguema Mbazogo of Equatorial Guinea does not hide his intention of having his son take over from him. Thus, like a prince, the son is waiting to inherit the throne and is now the vice president of the country. E. The late President Omar Bongo succeeded in turning Gabon into a political dynasty. Hence, Ali, his son, ascended the presidential throne when his father passed away. F. The most established dynasty is that of the Nasingbe family in Togo. G. When President Idris Deby suddenly died, the political maneuvering resulted in his son, General Muhammad Idris Deby, taking power, thereby creating a political dynasty in Chad. H. Even President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda is alleged to be grooming his son to take over from him. Thus, African rulers invite military coups when they turn multi-ethnic and multi-religious countries into personal political fiefdoms and enthrone their children dynastically as heads of state. 16. Due to personal ambition, many African rulers ignore the multi-ethnic and multi-religious nature of their countries and appoint Muslim members of their families, ethnic groups, and regions to critical national security positions so that they can achieve their personalization, tribalization, and regionalization agenda. This sometimes instigate the military to act. There are many examples to cite from. A. Even though there is a continental outcry against the nepotistic, tribalistic, and regionalistic behavior of some African rulers, recently President Emmanuel Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe appointed his son and nephew as ministers, following a very controversial election in Zimbabwe. 17. Almost every member of the African ruling elite receives medical services overseas. Normally, they use state funds to sponsor their foreign medical trips, and the citizens are forced to rely on dilapidated and under-equipped, crowded healthcare facilities at home. Therefore, African countries are like the animal farms, where some people can do whatever they want and the rest of the citizens cannot do what they want. It does not occur to many African rulers to build first-class medical facilities at home so that they and their citizens can benefit from the wealth of their nations. No. They have to go overseas and the citizens have to remain at home. 18. They use government institutions and financial resources as their personal property by openly defying the constitutions of their countries. When the citizens decry the practice, it attracts military attention. 19. Since the opposition is not allowed to play democratic politics by presenting alternative points of view to that of the ruling political parties, the opposition political parties are rendered ineffective, thereby preventing them from enabling the citizens to make alternative choices. This kills democracy in Africa. The suffocation of the opposition prompts the military to intervene. This is where citizens line up to vote. As you can see, in every election, the citizens convinced they will change the situation around, line up massively to vote, but the elections are always rigged. 20. Almost all national election commissions and agencies that are responsible for conducting elections in Africa are allegedly corrupt and controlled by the ruling political parties. The most recent cases of manipulated elections are those of Gabon, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe. The Gabonese election Commission was alleged to have awarded electoral victory to President Ali Bongo, thereby prompting military intervention. Most Nigerians do not seem to have any faith in the Independent National Electoral Commission. The politicians working through judges whom they control decide who wins or not in Nigerian elections. The Zimbabwe Election Commission is like that of Nigeria and other African countries, which always makes sure that the ruling political party wins, regardless of the credibility of the elections. Similarly, the judges tend to rule in favor of the person in power and the political party that controls the reign of power. So, the imported legal systems are also in shambles. 21. The desire of most African rulers to rule endlessly by amending the constitution destroys the democratic system and lays the conditions for the possibility of military coups. It is amazing that the ruling elites in Africa assume that they can retain power as much as they want without any consequence. It should be recalled that frustrations that emanated from the actions of some high-handed, corrupt, dictatorial, and unaccountable rulers prompted the masses to rebel in Tunisia in late 2010. The rebellion turned into the Arab Spring that engulfed many African and Middle Eastern countries. Like in many other African countries, some members of the ruling elite in Kenya, particularly Senator Samson Cherargei, are floating the idea of amending the Kenyan constitution to allow for the elongation of the terms of the president from 5 to 7 years. The ensuing debate is heating up the Kenyan polity and spreading rumors about the possibility of a military coup in the country. Why will any politician want to amend the constitution? Is 5 years not enough for somebody to become a president? This is a picture of the Arab Spring in Tunisia. This is a mob during the Arab Spring in Egypt. 22. Since the ruling political parties do not allow the opposition political parties to play their roles to effectuate democracy, it is the military that serves as an opposition political party to the ruling political cliques in Africa. Hence, when the citizens feel frustrated and angry because the ruling cliques do not allow free discussion of issues, they call on the military to kick out the politicians. Hence, Tunde Olusunle quoted a statement attributed to former President Jerry Rawlings of Ghana, who justified military intervention by saying, and I quote, "If the people are crushed by the elite, it is up to the army to give the people their freedom." Unquote. Indeed, if civilian authorities make it impossible for democracy to take root and grow to the benefit of all citizens, it is only the military that can intervene to stop the abuse of the people by the ruling civilian elite. Again, this is news headlines about African rulers clinging to power. 23. It is unfortunate that politicians tend to assume that they can toil with the people's emotions without paying the price in the form of a sudden military coup. The reason is that the members of the armed forces are also members of the same societies. Consequently, if the political elite mismanages the economy, loots public funds uncontrollably, abuses the civil rights of the people, and rules dictatorially to the point of creating much hardship, military and police personnel too will be affected by the hardship, thereby prompting them to do something. Similarly, the members of the armed and police forces have families, villages, and communities that suffer due to the recklessness of the politicians. Therefore, if their families and communities suffer as a result of political recklessness due to misrule, the soldiers will be compelled to intervene. 24. Military coups are not necessarily incompatible with African cultures. It should be noted that in some pre-colonial African societies, it was accepted as proper and necessary for incompetent and corrupt political leaders to be forcefully evicted from power. There were cases where incompetent leaders were forced to commit suicide or be killed for failing to rule wisely. Thus, regicide was practiced by some African societies to get rid of unpopular and incompetent or aged leaders. There were also cases where incompetent or irresponsible leaders were banished and sent into exile to never return. Thus, pre-colonial Africa allowed many revolutions to take place against the ruling elite by forcing incompetent and corrupt leaders to forfeit their authority through banishment and killing if necessary. 25. Moreover, to ensure institutional compatibility, the traditional leaders in pre-colonial Africa combined many roles. Thus, many kings and queens were also warriors to some extent, as well as spiritualists, mystics, herbalists, judges, and so on and so forth. The fact that many kings and queens and council of chiefs were warriors and possessed mystical, spiritual, and herbal knowledge made them amenable to both civilian and military authorities. Hence, the warrior class accepted them as leaders because the ruling elite was familiar with the military culture of society. Consequently, there was no separation between civilian authority and the military institution in a remarkable manner in pre-colonial Africa. 26. Unfortunately, in modern Africa, due to colonialism and Western influence, civilian authority is separated from the military institution, and the military is ordered to be led by civilian authority. Due to Western influence, it is emphasized globally that the military must come under the authority of civilian authority. This requirement is un-African because how can a warrior serve under a civilian who has no military experience? Culturally, the requirement that the military must come under the authority of civilian authority creates a conflict between the military institution and civilian authority in Africa because Africa is not Europe. In particular, since many politicians are like chameleons and change their positions like wind, it makes it difficult for African soldiers to respect civilian authority. Thus, the African soldier finds it unpalatable that he or she could be compelled to risk his or her life to fight a war initiated by some hypocritical politicians who are only interested in remaining in power. This lack of trust in civilian authority contributes to military coups in Africa, since politicians are not members of the military class, like in the pre-colonial era, in which the ruling elites were largely also members of the military class in most African societies. 27. Sensing the cultural contradiction between Western insistence that the military must come under civilian authority and the African cultural tendency to integrate both military and civilian authority. The late Chief Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria developed the theory of military-civilian diarchy. Basically, Dr. Azikiwe suggested the integration of both areas of society to form a united government made up of both military personnel and civilians, rather than the Western format which separates the civilians from the military and insists that the military must come under civilian authority. And finally, 28. Unfortunately, the military does not behave and act better than the civilian autocrats, which they overthrow for the following reasons. A. Modern African military forces are the products of former colonial powers. B. It should be recalled that the army and police were established and used to facilitate the conquest of Africa by the colonial powers. C. Even after the so-called independence, African military personnel continued to treat the civilian population as conquered subjects. They have no problem brutalizing the citizens and assisting dictatorial civilian rulers to impose themselves on the people. This is a military coup taking place as soldiers patrol the streets. D. The leader of the coup that overthrew President Ali Bongo is the cousin of Ali, meaning that the coup could be a pretext to continue to perpetuate Bongoism, unless the general demonstrates clearly that he is not beholden to the internal colonial order of the Bongo family in Gabon. However, it is hoped that the military rulers in today's Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Chad, Niger, and Gabon will change the narrative, as many Africans expect them to launch a new beginning for the continent. In conclusion, it is obvious that modern African countries are inherently unstable due to the artificiality of their political foundations and institutions. The peculiar nature of their existence is compounded by the behavior of African rulers who claim to be democrats but rule in an authoritarian manner. 2. They do not have regard for democracy, the constitution, and the rule of law because they are driven solely to be in power and nothing else. And 3. They generally do not care about how the citizens feel. 4. They pay little or no attention to the multi-ethnic and multi-religious nature of their countries and rule them as personal fiefdoms, with the expectation of turning them into family dynasties. 5. They personalize, tribalize, and regionalize the countries to the extent that results in discrimination and marginalization of other ethnic groups, regions, and religious members. The anger and frustration lead to pressure on the military to intervene. 6. African rulers do not allow the citizens and opposition parties to thrive in order to enhance the democratic system. This leads to frustration and anger and the need for military intervention. 7. They form alliances with foreign countries and multinational corporations to exploit the resources of their countries while rendering their citizens poor and angry, thereby necessitating the need for military intervention. 8. African rulers want to rule forever, regardless of the constitutional limitation of terms of office. The effort leads to the pressure on the military to act. 9. Instead of using the security forces to protect the national security of the state, African rulers use them to clamp down on the citizens, the opposition parties, and the media, thereby compelling a section of the population to call for military intervention. 10. The contravention of the constitutions and the rule of law in order to remain in power endlessly constitutes a civilian political coup against the citizens. If politicians can stage coups to get into power and or remain in power, then the military cannot be blamed for staging coups against civilian authorities. And 11, indeed, it is the coups staged by civilian political authorities that instigate military to intervene in politics in Africa. 12. So far, only the late President Nelson Mandela of South Africa ruled for only one term and left. It is sad that no other African ruler is willing to emulate the noble son of the continent who was a true patriot and democrat. It is unbelievable that after serving more than 20 years in prison for the struggle to free the country from the apartheid system, he got into power and served for only one term. Nelson Mandela deserved to be deified and called a saint. Saint Mandela, thank you for being great. The following suggestions are made. 1. To reduce the possibility of military coups taking place in Africa, the African Union and the regional organizations such as the Economic Community of West African States, the Economic Community of Central African States, the East African Community, the South African Development Community, the Arab Maghreb Union, and the Community of Saharan States must include clauses in their constitutions indicating that no African ruler should rule more than 2 terms. A court similar to the International Criminal Court should be established to prosecute political leaders who embezzle public funds, contravene their constitutions, and infringe on the rights of individuals, ethnic groups, and regions in the continent. 2. The winner-takes-all Western style of party politics should be replaced by an African-oriented political system that emphasizes a win-win based on compromise and consensus principle. 3. Eliminate the political parties and use the ethnic groups as the basis for sending people to the National Assembly to represent the citizens. Each representative will directly represent an ethnic group that makes up the country. Ethnic representatives are more likely to empathize with the citizens than the current party system that fosters self-centeredness and greed. 4. Rotate the presidency by dividing the country into presidential zones based on ethnic groups or regions or religions. This means that after a particular president has completed his or her term of office, the presidency should shift to another presidential zone where a new candidate will take over. Thus, no president will serve more than the time stipulated in the Constitution. By so doing, the ruler for life syndrome will be eliminated. In Rwanda, for instance, the next president should be a Hutu to reduce rivalry and tension. 5. It is necessary to visit the Chief Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe's military-cum-civilian diarchy model. This system calls for a political system in which both the military and civilians work jointly to run the government, without the military being subservient to civilian authority, as in the current Western model. Thank you for listening to this presentation. Please subscribe to the channel and listen to other very enlightening presentations. Again, thank you very much.